Welcome everyone that has signed on to this webinar. I see we're approaching 150 participants right now. We had over 400 actually register for this event, so I think that this is going to continue to climb up over the next few minutes. Thank you all for taking the time to join us. The speaker bios are available in an email that was sent to all participants this morning. So if you're looking for some more detail and background on the speakers, that is available and should be in your inbox if you registered for this event. I want to call your attention to the dedicated Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question for the panelists, please enter it there. There's also a feature where you can vote on questions that have been asked by others, and this will bring those questions up to the top, and our moderator will look at those questions first. So if you're not posing a question, but you see questions that you'd be really interested in hearing answered, please do use that voting function. There's also a chat box available. If you're having any technical issues, please type them in there, and Brian from our office or myself will try to respond to you on the fly and hopefully help iron out any technical issues. I think most people are familiar with Zoom by now, given the current situation. So I'm sure you're all experts as far as that goes. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this session, Dr. Ryan Wiley, President of Shift Health. Ryan has been an incredible member of Life Sciences Ontario, a collaborator, a volunteer. He co-chairs our annual policy forum. He's been a great supporter, not just of our organization, but really of the entire life sciences ecosystem here in Ontario and across Canada. I know Ryan wears many, many hats. I sit on a few committees with him in various roles. So it's a great pleasure to hand it off to Ryan to walk through a presentation that his group has put together regarding COVID-19 and the future of our health research and innovation system before starting this panel session. So Ryan, over to you.
Great, and thank you, Jason, and thank you to Life Sciences Ontario for giving us the opportunity today to, I think, convene a very important discussion around the future of health research and innovation. You know, as an organization that works exclusively with the health research and innovation ecosystem in Ontario, across Canada and around the world, you know, we've been giving a lot of thought to what COVID-19 means for the future of health research and innovation, because as we have seen a lot of adaptations implemented over the past couple of months, we've also seen the ability of our health research and innovation system to perform with perhaps far greater agility and alacrity and even ambition than we had potentially envisioned. And so I'm really happy to share a few thoughts today about what that might mean, mainly share a few questions, and get into a discussion with the esteemed panelists whom we have convened. And I'd like to begin then by introducing them. And we have a wonderful group of individuals who bring quite diverse perspectives to this conversation. First, I'd like to welcome and introduce Connie Côté, who is the CEO of the Health Charities Coalition of Canada. Welcome, Connie.
Thank you. It's nice to be here today.
Bogi Eliasen, who is the Director of Health at the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies. And I understand, Bogi, that you are joining from your home in the Faroe Islands. So thank you for sacrificing your evening for this conversation. I also understand that the Faroe Islands is a COVID-19 free oasis. So hopefully you can share some insights into what has allowed the Faroe Islands to succeed.
Yes, thank you, I will. And it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Bogi. I'm also delighted to welcome Dr. Charu Kaushic, who is the Scientific Director of the Institute of Infection and Immunity at the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. Welcome, Charu.
Thank you, Ryan.
And Dr. Jim Tartaglia, who is joining us from Pennsylvania, the Vice President of R&D and Global Head of Projects at Sanofi Pasteur. Welcome, Jim.
Great to be here. Look forward to the discussion.
Thanks. So I want to begin just by setting the stage with a few thoughts on what COVID-19 means for the future of health research and innovation. And I think, my thesis or hypothesis here is that COVID-19 really is transforming the health research and innovation ecosystem in ways that are dramatic and likely permanent. In just weeks, we have seen adaptations within health research and innovation that otherwise could have evolved over years, if not a generation. And there are many ways in which we're seeing change. We're seeing the mainstreaming of approaches to science and collaboration and interdisciplinarity that previously we considered avant-garde or marginal. We are coming to terms with limitations and challenges in our approach to data collection, information sharing, and public engagement. And we are revisiting conventions and rules and regulatory approaches that were once sacrosanct, but we're now seeing opportunities to enable unparalleled agility in the face of a crisis. And although the wartime metaphor has perhaps been overused, it does invite the question, is this crisis-induced response a wartime improvisation and we're going to return to some sort of normal, or have we let the genie out of the bottle here? So what will peacetime, if you will, look like? And I think the more important corollary to that question is, can and should science ever really be at peace? Because when you look at the annual deaths by cause across the globe, and these are 2017 data from the Global Burden of Disease study, you can see that cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementia, digestive disease, all will kill vastly more people this year than COVID-19. And we often talk about the war against cancer or the war against dementia, but COVID-19 is really showing us what's possible when we put a wartime mindset into action. So what are we seeing? And I want to highlight 5 phenomena that we think are germane and that invite further discussion. The first is that we're seeing a rapid acceleration of the use of data and digital tools and digitalization, sort of marking, if you will, the end of the beginning of health digitalization in the context of COVID-19. We're also seeing the exploration and experimentation with regulations and practices that triangulate safety, quality, and speed. We're seeing a rapid growth and experimentation with collaborative models that perhaps better meet the needs and the urgent pace of innovation. We're seeing signs that the public is more engaged with science than ever before, and that trust is building in scientific institutions, and perhaps we're propelling the opportunity for a citizen-engaged science. And finally, we are really casting a spotlight through COVID-19 on the global interconnectedness of science, innovation, and human health. And I want to explore each of these phenomena briefly now to really just set the stage for discussion with our panelists. So the first is data and digitalization, and the fact that COVID-19 really has allowed for invention and improvisation across the health data ecosystem in ways that have really not only driven our public health response, but also enabled research and innovation. We've seen that data and digital tools have enabled real-time decision-making, driven innovation, and actually empowered the public, both in terms of access to information, but also in terms of the public being able to share data that are supporting our response. But at the same time, the pandemic is also making it impossible to ignore critical gaps in our in health digitalization. I'll name 3. first, the fact that we have very inconsistent and incomplete data collection, which in many cases is resulting in a very superficial understanding of how the disease is transmitting, particularly through subpopulations in Canada and across the globe. We're also seeing that our data systems are disparate, disconnected, and not interoperable. And this is really limiting the ability to build scale. And I'm not talking about interoperable across countries necessarily. I'm talking about interoperable between institutions that are on the same street. So it really is a frustration for public health officials and for researchers. And we're also seeing that a lack of consensus on how we interpret privacy, security, and risk is limiting our ability to share data. So there is an opportunity, in that COVID-19 as a crisis is also a data crisis. There's an opportunity to think about what that future-proof data ecosystem in the future might look like. There are many examples within COVID-19 of how we've unleashed the power of data to drive research and enable decision making. And I will just provide a couple of examples for illustrative purposes. For example, Korea, which of course was impacted very early in the pandemic, before we knew much about transmission or what this, how best to control COVID-19. Activated an approach that recognized the value of real-world data contributed by civilians. And although the system is not perfect, the results are clear in that the per capita rate of infection in Korea is about 20 per 100,000. Canada's rate is more than 10 times that. At the same time, COVID-19 has exposed the scientific and public health impact and implications of weak data. There have been challenges at all levels in terms of the reliability and inconsistency of data, in terms of the ability for member countries to provide WHO with useful information upon which decisions can be made. And there are many, many other examples. So this is a moment, if you will, to advance systemic changes in how we regulate and structure our health data ecosystem. But if we're to build on this watershed moment, we need to be clear about a number of things. We need to be clear about the attributes that we expect to see in an accountable data ecosystem. We probably need to evolve from rigid interpretations of privacy to see privacy as an enabler. We need to take more of a risk-based approach that recognizes that in many cases, the benefits of sharing personal health data outweigh the risks which can be managed. We need to leverage the power of AI, ensure that our systems are interoperable. And we also need to perhaps re-engineer regulatory and reimbursement systems so that they can adapt to and accept different kinds of data, such as real-world evidence, in order to accelerate the adoption, the generation and the adoption of innovation. So that's the first phenomenon that I wanted to highlight. The second is the adaptation of regulations and practices that are really accelerating research, development, and the adoption of innovation. Even yesterday, Health Canada issued a number of important regulatory changes in the context of COVID-19 to drive COVID-19 related R&D, including expanding the definition of the health professionals who can run a clinical trial, or making it easier for patients to participate in studies remotely, among many other changes. But these changes have much longer term implications potentially, and that spirit of exceptionalism in the context of COVID-19 must always be balanced against the need for safety and the need for scientific quality, reliability, and utility, because we certainly don't want to repeat the mistakes, for example, of the 2014-2015 Ebola outbreak, where the decision to relax standards of trial design and randomization resulted in results that were uninterpretable, wasting time, wasting resources, and potentially expending lives. And so we really need to think about how we triangulate safety, quality, and speed, not only in the context of COVID-19, but to strengthen our research and innovation in the future, both preserving high standards and accelerating the pace of science and innovation. We've seen many examples of this. We've seen examples that show us that speed and rigor are not necessarily incompatible. We've also seen examples where leniency and quality often are incompatible. One example of speed and rigor being interoperable is our large-scale studies that have been supported by the WHO, the Solidarity Trial, as well as the US-led Operation Warp Speed, which is enrolling, subjects in very large trials, executed under master protocols, that is allowing for rapid alterations of trial parameters based on emerging results, and really potentially accelerating vaccine and therapeutic development. But on the other hand, leniency can be dangerous or disruptive. Early in the pandemic, the FDA issued relaxed regulations with respect to the use of tests of diagnostic tests before the agency reviewed validation data. This decision ultimately was reversed because the market was flooded with ineffective and, in some cases, outright fraudulent diagnostics. So finding that balance and learning from this experience is going to be critical to the future of health research and innovation. And so the conventions and regulations and practices that we're developing now, or that we're experimenting now, will only be durable if we can show that they avoided unacceptable safety risks, if they really did accelerate the generation and analysis of high quality scientific and clinical findings, if they allowed us to make better decisions based on more reliable evidence, and also resulted in cost and time savings that allowed us to manage this pandemic more effectively and accountably. Third, and importantly, COVID-19 has really been a story of collaboration and has enabled the experimentation with new models of collaboration in health research and innovation across sectors. It's been invaluable to achieving a speed, scale, and scope. And we're seeing that public, private, academic sectors, rather than competing with each other, are joining forces to compete with the problem. And it's demonstrating that global challenges really do require global partnerships, but it's also exposing trade-offs that we need to come to terms with. So this is creating a context for action that is rapidly expanding and evolving how we work together, but also leading us to reflect on how we create value together in the future. And again, there are so many examples represented by the panelists who have joined us today on collaborative approaches that have emerged in the context of COVID-19. And I would say that the approaches and platforms are not necessarily new. In many cases, we've been talking about them or testing them for a while, but their sudden propagation is unprecedented and potentially quite disruptive for health research and innovation in the future. We've seen collaborations form very, very quickly with the Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, MasterCard, and 15 pharma companies, for example, in sharing proprietary compound libraries to accelerate development of therapeutics. We've also seen expanded use of innovative platforms. Transcelerate is an example. It's a collaboration of 21 global pharma companies where de-identified, anonymized preclinical and clinical data are shared, including study arms, control arms, to accelerate vaccine and therapeutic development. And there are many other examples, and I'm sure our panelists will speak to those today. But how do you sustain this spirit of collaboration? What's it going to take? Because undoubtedly, some of this spirit of collaboration is a matter of survival in a crisis, but some of it is, I think, much more transformative, because it has demonstrated the astounding potential of collaboration to do a lot very quickly. And stakeholders, and I think especially the public, are probably going to expect to see other health and societal challenges benefit from the power of diverse stakeholders coming together. So it's going to invite us to reevaluate the boundaries of the pre-competitive space, to learn new approaches to IP ownership, and to rethink the alignment of incentives and risks. Fourth, COVID-19 may be ushering in what I like to call a post-truth era, in that the COVID-19 pandemic is arguably arriving at a precarious moment for science and truth, where objective facts have often carry less weight in public discourse than emotional pleas, and where an inconvenient fact can be turned into a convenient fiction, propagated efficiently through Facebook before Facebook can pull it down. But in the case of COVID-19, we're dealing with something much more existential for people, much more visceral. And I think it's inviting individuals to be a little bit more vigilant, a little bit more discriminating about how they appraise and connect with knowledge, and creating an opportunity, perhaps, to reinvigorate the relationship between the public and the scientific establishment, awaken science literacy, and restore our collective faith. In fact, in this moment when COVID-19 has really made science the star and science the solution. There are many ways we can look at this, and while we're optimistic that we're seeing growing public trust in science, I think we cannot deny the fact that COVID-19 is also fueling an anti-establishment sentiment that we need to counteract critically. On the one hand, certainly, a confidence in leadership is shifting toward the scientific and medical community. Polls taken throughout the pandemic have consistently shown, for example, that more Americans trust Dr. Fauci's COVID-19 comments than those of Donald Trump. Thank goodness for that. But it's, I think, really does speak to an awakening of public interest in science. And for most Americans, Dr. Fauci was unknown before the pandemic. At the same time, anti-vaccination forces, for example, or conspiracy theorists have really exploited COVID-19 to propagate dubious claims, and those claims really are propagated. The famous, or infamous, I should say, plandemic video that was released several weeks ago garnered, and which claims that elites are using the virus and vaccines to gain power, garnered more traction in social media, in Facebook, for example, than mainstream events. Substantially more traction before Facebook was able to pull it down, which took about a week and a half. So we are at this very important moment for science and truth, and I think we have to seize the opportunity afforded by the resurgence in the public's faith in fact, but we can take nothing for granted. The burden and responsibility in the scientific community to approach this engagement with humility, not hubris, is critically important if we are to foster an accountable and citizen-engaged science. We need to respect and be accountable to the public's expectations. We need to give genuine consideration to the public's viewpoints throughout the innovation process. We probably need to exhibit a commitment to and a greater skill in communicating science. And we probably need to humanize science more in the future so that it's not this monolithic and remote thing, but it is a human endeavor. And like all human endeavors, it's fallible, it's alive, and it's a collective responsibility. And finally, I think we've seen the fact that COVID-19 has really cast a spotlight on our increasingly global systems of health and innovation in ways that are positive and in ways that are challenging. The very markers that define us as modern, population growth, urbanization, industrial growth and farming practices, economic growth, at the same time are major drivers of the evolution of COVID-19. And the spread of COVID-19 so rapidly and indiscriminately across the globe is a reflection of how connected we are. Research and innovation systems have benefited from these advances, have benefited from global interconnectedness, but also COVID-19 has shown and exposed vulnerabilities in supply chains, vulnerabilities in sovereign health security, vulnerabilities in terms of the impact of disrupted ecological balances on our health. So COVID-19 has magnified this tension between the global imperatives of health innovation and the globalization risks that can fuel protectionism, both the two sides of this globalization coin. And there are this tension really spans the continuum from the questions that we ask to the innovations that we develop. There's a lot, much greater calls for the integration of planetary, animal, and human health and research in the context of COVID-19, and that could and probably will shape research agendas well into the future. At the same time, jurisdictions have lamented the lack of local, for example, biomanufacturing capacity, which is a threat to sovereign health security and a threat to individual countries' ability to provide innovative health solutions that are needed to control the pandemic in the future. So our connectivity has contributed to the pandemic, and it's also fundamental to resolving it. And so we really need in the future to optimize those global connections that are central to research, innovation, and planetary health. We need global commitment and collective action, recognizing that the challenges we face, that no jurisdiction can single-handedly solve them. We need to emphasize the linkages between human health and the sustainability of social and economic systems and the questions we ask. We need to focus on a global health justice for all, because everyone is vulnerable unless everyone in the world has access to the innovations and solutions that are needed to manage global health challenges. And of course, we need to elevate transdisciplinary models of research and innovation. So, like all crises, COVID-19 has created an urgent opportunity to do better and to learn for the future. We're at an inflection point, I would argue. We are at an inflection point in part because there's never been greater recognition that science is the solution. And so there's never been, arguably a more fertile moment to reinvigorate investment in health research and create the best system possible. So to help us understand or reflect on the contours of what that new normal will look like, I'm delighted now to engage our panelists in a discussion, and then open it up to our audience for further questions and discussion. So thank you all. I would like to begin by talking a little bit about some of the changes we're seeing within data systems and practices and research practices across the globe. And Bogi, I'd like to start with you, if I might, because you've done a lot of work over the past several years working with health systems around the globe to accelerate digitalization and data science, both to improve how we deliver care, but also to drive science, drive research and innovation. And in the context of COVID-19, as I just mentioned, digitalization has arguably been one of the greatest enablers and also one of the greatest frustrations. So how is COVID-19, in your view, altering our relationship with data and digital tools? And what does that mean for systems of research and innovation? Are we at a turning point?
Yes, first, thank you for a great introduction and presentation of the topics and different aspects of it. Yes, there are great changes. I am both positive as you are on some parts, but I'm also very scared on other parts and worried. So I've been pushing more data, for instance, the telemedicine part for maybe 10 years. So now when I see what COVID can change in 14 days, I feel like I've been Don Quixote banging on the windmills, more or less. Because what you saw changing was, for instance, in the Nordic countries, you had an uptake of 5% for telemedicine GP appointments, and that of course went to 95% in 2 weeks, because that was the only option. And the technology has been there for more or less 10 years, a decade. So you see some of these things which were ready or semi-ready, fast implemented because you needed to do it. And I think we need to distinguish between data and digital function. This is often mixed when we talk about data. I highly appreciate what you also pushed on substandards and standards and what we do. I do think that we have had a huge progress, but a lot of it is not sustainable. So there is a huge window of opportunity so I think our responsibility, because what comes in here is that we have a paradigm shift that has been lying there since the Human Genome Project was finished in 2013, waiting a little bit. What can we do? How do we do this? Are there different ways? And we should not forget that the Human Genome Project was actually made on a totally free data sharing concept, where everything was uploaded inside 24 hours for the world to use. And we thought we had solved it. We thought that was the Holy Grail, and everybody went back to not sharing again afterwards. So we just need to remember that it's not always that we go forward just because we stepped a step forward. I do think that we have 3 months ago, I was struggling getting people to understand that we have to bridge individual data with aggregated data, that we have to bridge the individual's well-being with the public well-being. That's not a discussion you have to take anymore. People get it. What worries me more now is the lack of statistical and biological literacy in the discussion. So that's where we have talked a lot about health literacy. It's still an issue, but when we come into a crisis like this, it's also very important that what we communicate, that people actually can get. So I do see a progress and an opportunity in all of these bad things with the crisis, but I don't think it will come easy. It requires, as I've said for the last 10 years, it's not a question about that we have to innovate more technology per se. Of course, we have to innovate all the time, but we need the decisions to go forward on using what we have. We should remember that we only use 3% of the data that we produce. So it's not the data production per se that's the issue. But when you take a decision from the political or decision maker level in institutions, being public and private, you would also need to enable the enforcement of that decision. So it's not enough just to take the decision. And these are going to be the crucial points in actually realizing the window of opportunity that we have. I think this is a chance of a lifetime to leapfrog, but it won't come easy.
Thank you, Bogi. And I want to ask a similar question of you, Charu. Data obviously has been important in terms of our agility or lack of agility, depending on the circumstance. But from your point of view, very much at the front lines of the scientific community's response to COVID-19, what is it revealing about the agility and resilience of our research systems and practices, whether it's peer review or study design or how we fund research? And what opportunities do you see emerging to improve regulations and conventions in the future?
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. So really good question, but I would also like to start by saying, thank you for that introductory talk, because it very nicely summarized sort of the things that we didn't think we were capable of doing that we're doing, and there's no going back on many of those things. And at the same time, the change has occurred so fast that we are probably taking some missteps, and as will happen with anything that changes so quickly with speed, that there will be some look back and corrections that will probably have to be done. So that's very much true I can tell you from, my experience at CIHR and what CIHR and the Canadian response and to this has been in terms of funding researchers and funding research that is aligned with finding solutions. So first of all, I'll agree with you that I never heard so many journalists and newscasters talk about immune responses and antibodies before.
Yeah.
You and I are immunologists, so this is something that we are very familiar with. I've never heard that many people become specialists on immunology so quickly. So everybody is changing. I don't know who hasn't changed in terms of the changes that are coming. So going to the question that you were asked, how is the research ecosystem changing? So at every level, I'll give you examples of CIHR had never before put together something with such speed as we did our first phase 1 response, right? So I was looking back in preparation for this discussion just to look back and see, and on 10th of February, we announced the phase 1 research response. I was in Geneva on 14th and 15th for the WHO meeting. On the flight back, I was revising the opportunity to align it with the WHO's R&D blueprint that was coming out. And on 28th February, 2 weeks later, we had funded 54 grants. 3 weeks later, we funded another 50 grants. So 99 grants were funded in less than 6 weeks, and the collaboration was among the tri-agencies, IDRC, so we had multiple partners that came up. In any time before, that kind of coordination among multiple partnering federal funding agencies, which takes a whole process to go through. So it was an amazing adaptation that never before we thought was possible, and we did it. And then 6-8 weeks later, we are doing it again. The phase 2 funding is now out, and the review from the time of the submission to the announcement of the grants is going to be about 4 weeks. So the funding ecosystem has adjusted. Large pots of funding have been given out to the research funding agencies, the peer reviewers, so the Canadian and actually international health researchers have risen to the occasion. Hundreds of people have literally volunteered time to say, I will peer review. So over 1,000 people have peer reviewed for us in less than 3 months while transitioning, shutting down their labs, switching their programs to doing COVID research, being parents at home, homeschooling, and taking other things that are involved with it. So the resiliency, and then the response from the research community in terms of the grants we've received. The first time we thought, wow, 250 applications, how are we going to review and adjudicate those? In phase 2, at one point we had 2,500 applications open. Ultimately about 1,500 applications were submitted, but again, we never anticipated the response. So clearly people are very resilient, adjusting, and coming to the forefront with their amazing resiliency and adaptability from every level. And then I won't get into all the things that you covered in terms of international cooperation, the regulatory bodies sort of modifying their processes. So that's why I'm saying that I'm having a hard time saying who hasn't risen to the occasion and kind of adapted. Even the public response, this much literacy on very complex epidemiology and other issues, we've never seen this before. So those are all, things that are really, really clearly very, very coming to the front. But in terms of, what will stay and what will go, I will agree with Bogi that, it'll be interesting to see how many of these things stick, the level of cooperation, the agility of people to redirect their programs to doing COVID research. Some of these have also brought out issues that, again, are concerning, right? So we saw in some of the phase 1 response, we are able to look back on that. And clearly, while we wanted impactful research to come up as quickly as possible, the timelines that were compressed to meet that led to clear disparities in who was able to apply to those opportunities and how people were disadvantaged. So clearly those opportunities were great for people who were very well networked, working in teams, had translational partners, because they were able to quickly and able to apply. But community-based research and researchers, women, who didn't have large networks, early career investigators are clearly disadvantaged in those situations. So those are the concerning parts of, this has really gone well and what will come out of this. So I'll stop because I could talk about this for a long time.
That's great. You've raised some really important issues, and particularly from the perspective of a large national public sector funder. I want to ask a similar question, Jim, of you from a private sector perspective. What for you in terms of our research systems and regulations and practices are revealing about how agile and resilient we are, and what opportunities do you see going forward to maximize that triangle of safety, quality, and speed?
Okay. Thanks, Ryan, and thanks for the introductory remarks. It was very enlightening. And I will not tell Tony Fauci that he was well known up until COVID. But anyway, so I think I'll start by saying, just thinking about vaccine development for COVID, I think it's clear that there's been an unprecedented sharing of information, of data, and of reagents, as well as funding opportunities. And I think I'm well heartened with this to think that from a scientific, medical, and regulatory perspective, that best practices will emerge from the crisis, which is important. But I think there needs to be a very careful lessons learned towards this. And one that looks at lessons learned across the broader R&D and regulatory processes to see what aspects may have slowed us down, both with COVID and in other vaccine developments or pharmaceutical developments, and which really don't add value in looking at evidence generation and looking at ensuring safety and effectiveness of products. So I think we really have to look at value add perspectives on this. And so I think we need to ask that under the current situation, does it serve as an inflection point, helping to further harmonize global regulatory processes? I think we have to look at the big picture. And we can look at this one from a pandemic perspective, and while various global regulatory agencies have regular interfaces, does the concept of a global pandemic regulatory or consultative body make sense, or a committee make sense? But I also think that we have to think bigger. I think there needs to be political will to look at a broader regulatory harmonization, which really slows us down in ensuring access to products, especially vaccine products, and having to deal with different pharmacopoeias all over the world. And it's very difficult to ensure that access in a broader sense. So I think we have to look at broader regulatory harmonization. And you brought the idea of harmonized or master protocols that are vetted by regulators maybe helping. Yes, and we should look at that. But whether it's harmonized or whether it's a master protocol, they have pros and cons, both, especially from an execution or operational perspective that needs to be considered, and whether they actually slow things down or hasten the speed.
Fair.
I think one absolute that will come out of this crisis is that there will be sustained pressure on healthcare budgets and pricing of pharmaceutical products. And, one option is doing less from a company perspective, but I don't think that option should be on the table. There's a lot to be done with respect to addressing medical needs, global public health. So we need to find smarter ways to generate evidence. So essentially a cheaper evidence base that both recommending bodies and payers will accept. And I think COVID has brought forward some opportunities. I think it's jump-started the digital revolution in clinical trials and streamlined streamlining of clinical development plans. We've talked about it for years, but I think the rubber has met the road now, and I think we have some opportunities to learn and to move forward with this. This will, however, come with a high demand for additional phase 4 trials that will be needed to further assess both the safety and efficacy, effectiveness of products. I think the other thing that we need to better learn is how do we better leverage machine learning and artificial intelligence during the R&D process to facilitate process development, to facilitate clinical development, and to develop the analytics towards creating agility, facilitating decision-making, and increasing speed and reducing costs. Now, I just want to go into briefly, Ryan, one of the things you mentioned about being more entrepreneurial with respect to risk-taking, which is absolutely necessary for agility and how best to manage those risks. And when we're talking about risk here, especially in thinking, in therapeutics, your benefit risk profile is a little different than in prophylactic vaccines, where you're actually giving vaccines normally to healthy individuals, healthy subjects. So there's less appetite for risk from a prophylactic vaccination perspective. So we're not talking about, we're not compromising quality or subject safety, but we're talking about risk and advancing and making decisions and investing with high levels of unknowns, which I think from a pandemic perspective, it's necessary. It's necessary to go fast. It's necessary to make investments with unknowns in clinical trials, in the industrialization aspect. But we, as a company, can we do that on a routine basis? It's very difficult to, because you always have to have trade-offs then. And you're making these huge investments in clinical trials, in the industrialization, and it's not that you have one product that you're looking to develop. You have a portfolio. And when you prioritize one over the other, there's an inherent net effect or knockdown effect on some of the other aspects of the portfolio. So I think what you need to do is, yes, be entrepreneurial in how you look at the portfolio and the individual products that you're looking to develop, but managing them in a smart way and managing them to look at some of these opportunities from artificial intelligence, real-world data, real-world evidence to progress things as fast as possible, so in a timely and cost-effective manner. And I think a lot of it will be driven also by the target value proposition of the product, the target product profile, as well as the benefit risk, the perceived benefit risk profile of the product. So I think I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Jim. And I did want to actually just continue with you on one point. One area where I think all stakeholders, including industry, have been very entrepreneurial over the past few weeks is in driving R&D collaborations, company to company, company to government, company to academia, et cetera. I'm just wondering if this experience in COVID-19 with collaboration is altering expectations of the roles of public, private, and academic sectors, and what would you say is needed to sustain that spirit of collaboration?
Well, Ryan, I know we've worked together in some formats over the last 15 years, and you know my view on the importance of collaboration and partnerships, especially in global public health efforts such as HIV and pandemics such as COVID. And there's no doubt that there needs to be more collaboration, public-private partnership or otherwise. I think our example with partnering with GSK on a COVID vaccine, looking at what we have from an immunogen perspective and what they have from an adjuvant perspective, and marrying those goes a lot towards that. Now, government agencies that have substantial funding can foster this type of collaboration, and they have. We're working together with them with BARDA. And while we don't want to be in a position where we're always being told what to do by government agencies, with where we are today with COVID, it can certainly give us a pause for some introspection to see how best to regularly embrace these types of approaches, especially as we continue to operate in an environment of greater demand and an emphasis on acceleration, while at the same time we're trying to balance both financial and resource aspects. So partnerships are definitely important, and I think we all need to be able to partner better and leverage those partnerships from an entrepreneurial perspective. And I know there's been some questions on the type of competencies that one would should develop as they grow their careers, and certainly, from my perspective, an entrepreneurial mindset and entrepreneurial spirit, and how to effectively partner. You know, we as scientists, as we were being trained, it was at least when I was being trained a long time ago, it was more of a siloed approach, and don't say anything to anybody, and those types of things. So I think the world has evolved a lot since then, and it's a good thing, and it needs to continue to do that. But we definitely need entrepreneurial scientists that know how to partner and collaborate for the common good. I think one thing that our response to COVID certainly underscored was certainly collaboration with academia, government agencies, and NGOs. We've done that for years. But I think it's brought out a finer appreciation on the importance of engaging more effectively with other key stakeholders, such as regulatory agencies, CROs and CMOs, as well as with healthcare systems, different health systems. And to look to not only demonstrate vaccine efficacy and effectiveness in a highly streamlined fashion, but to scale up at risk and to be able to provide large volume of doses close to the day after efficacy as possible. So trying to leverage those relationships more finely towards that end, because you really need to look at it from an end-to-end perspective, because if you demonstrate efficacy and you can't deliver that, what's the point? Okay. And you know, so there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of key risks associated with accelerated plans, and you need to really wrap yourself around these partnerships, these relationships, to help you manage all of the risks in this end-to-end process. And one key area of concern for me is the area of fill finish of product. Fill finish capacity, even within a multinational company, is a bottleneck. So I think one of the things, and this is one of the things that keeps me up at night, and saying, okay, you're going to deliver how many hundreds of millions of doses by the end of the year or in a year, and I think it's really worrisome in a way. Yes, you can get bulk, you can get product, but can you fill and finish and deliver? So I think there needs to be, coming out of this crisis, there needs to be a more global effort to really look at that as a gap, and how collectively across the globe we can ready ourselves. Well, assuming that there'll be another pandemic, but hopefully not like this, but we'll certainly have waves that we're going to have to respond to. And I think the last piece I want to cover on this, that I think we have a better appreciation for, it's underlined the importance to be that could be, of certain partnerships that can be applied not only from a pandemic situation, but for other vaccine targets of interest. And it's in the area of real-world data partnerships, such as with health systems, with academic capacity. And with this, we look to leverage such partnerships to streamline development and leverage opportunities for smarter evidence generation and adaptive registration strategies. And Some of the key areas are really leveraging predictive epidemiology, certainly from a trial execution perspective, adaptive enrollment, use of data from medical records, using real-world data for targeted recruitment and enrollment, and the use of post-marketing real-world evidence for effectiveness and safety. So those are some of the points I wanted to raise on how I've evolved in some of my thoughts around partnerships through the COVID experience.
Thank you, Jim. That's excellent. And I want to turn now to Connie and talk about partnership in a different way, because we've talked a lot about sort of the research partnerships among public and private and academic, but we've heard less about approaches to patient partnership in research and the opportunities that COVID-19 is exposing. So in fact, if anything, COVID-19 has disenfranchised patients whose clinical studies have been canceled or suspended as a result of COVID-19. So what opportunities do you see for new models of patient-informed research coming out of COVID-19?
Well, thanks so much for this opportunity, Ryan. And I'm really pleased that you actually one of the things that we found, as you said, is that patients are kind of the lost group in all of this. They are most directly impacted by what has happened. The normal systems that have been there, as you said, we've heard of clinical trials being put on hold, labs have been shut down. They haven't had the same access that they've had to the providers, yet we're at a time when Canadians are really excited to find out about how is this new disease impacting my health, and how can I be better prepared to take care of my health? And so for the first time in a long time, we have all of Canada looking for new direction and looking to science and evidence and wanting to know, how can I be involved in it? And so our health charities have been working with public health, looking at the science and looking at the evidence to say, what is the best practice? What does the evidence say? And how is it going to guide behavior? And so, this is what we always hope for in terms of researchers. We want to make sure that what we're doing in the labs is actually translating into practice in the communities. So this is really good news. Like, to me, this is the best news we can have. But what does it actually mean in terms of how we're going to be able to work together is a real question, because now we have, Canadians with lived disease who have that lived experience, who are engaged and involved. And they have been throughout, but now it's at a level that they can understand much greater. And so as we think about how we're going to be able to apply these new learnings, we want to be able to really capitalize on that. And patients are hungry for this. We've seen some of that. SPORE certainly has set the strategy for patient-oriented research, has certainly laid down the foundation for how to begin doing that in research. But we need to be able to bring this further. There's several ways that we need to be able to engage patients or people living with disease into everyday practice. One of the things that we haven't been able to be involved in because of how quickly all of the COVID applications went out with is, what are we really expecting in terms of patient outcomes? Were patients actually involved in developing some of these funding opportunities? Were they involved in some of that? And we're not sure that, do we have time, do we have the process put in place to make sure that we're involved from the very beginning, we develop those outcome metrics, and that we're actually going to be there to deliver the ones at the end. So we want to be involved in the entire cycle. So that's how some of those partnerships are going to have to evolve. So in terms of, you asked, your original question was, how can we advance for patient-informed research? So the first is really to make sure that people can get involved from the very beginning. And that always has, anytime you're talking about, patient practices and informing patients, getting them involved, they have to be involved in your design. So get them involved very beginning. Make sure that when you're designing a plan, that the model includes that initial involvement. So early design is important. We're also looking at, think about how you can work across different disciplines. And I think, Jim, you also mentioned that when you were talking. So it's not just in one area. How can we get involved in many different groups, thinking about how would you involve patients in your area of practice? So it has to be across disciplines. We want to be able to explore partnerships and collaborations to really leverage scarce resources. We know that we're entering into a period where there's not going to be a lot of funding, or not going to have ample funding. We've never had ample funding research, but at this time, we want to make sure that we can really maximize that. And so, you know, where are the opportunities for collaboration and working together on specific areas of research? COVID has certainly demonstrated our ability to work together in crisis. And I think we really want to be able to harness that and be able to move forward, making sure that there is a space for the patient voice and all of that.
Thank you, Connie. And you just mentioned money and sustainability and resources, and maybe we'll turn to that that very topic now, and maybe start with you, Charu, because we've seen, understandably, I guess, that COVID-19 has subsumed the research ecosystem and kind of put everything else on pause. But how do thinking to the future, how do you create a research system and a funding environment that can continue to advance work on COVID-19, that can sustain focus on other health priorities, and that can have flexibility to respond to the next COVID-19? Not an easy question. You're on mute, Charu. Just.
Yes, thanks, Ryan, for that. So as you can imagine, that at CIHR, we spend a lot of time on these very thoughts, right? So in fact, this morning I was consulting with a couple of advisory boards that work with my institute regarding, pandemic preparedness and CIHR's role and what's the future and when and how can we fulfill that role. So we spend a lot of time in terms of discussing that. It's not lost on us that even as a lot of research and researchers are redirecting their efforts on COVID, there is a majority or large proportion of researchers whose labs are shut down and that are, 3 months out and not doing any work. Students are not working, researchers are not working. There's tremendous financial pressures. So in terms of the, looking at the full spectrum, there's a recovery phase that's definitely within the eyesight of, and as Connie indicated, and we are seeing that live, that at one point, putting together CIHR's plan, the 5-year strategic plan, and we were thinking CIHR is a player in a research ecosystem. And now we are seeing much of that ecosystem, especially, those partners that would organizations, sort of are falling apart. And the government-funded research system or research organizations are the ones that have to take on added responsibilities for the work that was being done by these partners. So there's sustainability issues on many different levels. And of course, the easiest answer is, how do we divide the pie? Well, let's just increase the pie, right? I mean, I hear there's not a single meeting that CIHR organizes or that I participate in where I don't hear that. Like, why don't we just find more money for research? So, one of the things that I always say to people is that, it's time for every one of us to advocate. If you believe in science, let's advocate. So there's never been a better time to advocate for more funding and more money into research that can look into, long-term sustainability than now, because governments, public, all of those people whose advocacy and who need to hear these voices are listening now. So that's the first part of sustainability, is that let's just try to increase the pie so that we can actually try to do all of those things. Focus on COVID, do pandemic preparedness, continue to focus on chronic diseases and issues, because all of those are important. In terms of, and it's not that that has not been on the radar. It's just how long is it on radar and how long can you sustain the interest of both public researchers and governments. Last year we were all about vaping and opioid crisis. Right, that was the emergency of the day. So there is a portfolio of different things that come and go that change the interest. So then it behooves us to then think of a longer term strategic vision to say, how can we continue? And for about 15 years after SARS in 2003, 2004, there was funding that was there. Was it there at the level that we are using now, where every funding opportunity is hundreds of millions of dollars? No, but there was definitely sustained activity. So that's the kind of vision that we need now to sort of see how can we fund long-term, so that's the funding aspect. The other thing that can bring efficiency into sustainability is we're seeing very clearly now that there are efficiencies in how we do research. Internationally, people are coming together to reduce redundancies. Even the adaptable coordinated clinical trials that WHO is coordinating, it's all about what are we going to drop? They just dropped hydrochloroquine, or they at least stopped for now hydrochloroquine, saying we don't even know if we want to continue with this. Let's find other, candidates that are. So that's a good example of every country doing similar things. Within the country, can we do better coordination and find efficiencies? Team science, team-based approach. We're seeing that's the winning strategy, that one person cannot do everything. What Jim was saying, that, probably when he and I were being trained, it was all about my lab, our lab, my PI, what does he do? Now it's much more team-based approach, and how can we quickly adapt to bring researchers and platforms and networks that can do large-scale clinical trials. So that's another strategy for long-term sustainability, that it's all about teams that can quickly adapt to new environments, new needs, and are not completely focused on that one that they have. And then finally, I would emphasize the importance of platforms. One of the reasons why agencies and organizations like CEPI, the Coalition for Endemic Preparedness Innovation, have been quick out of the barn is because they were preparing their platforms for 2.5 years. So those kind of cross-cutting platforms that can be applied. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had within the federal agencies talking about, do we have enough capacity within Canada for large-scale phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials? We don't have a cross-country clinical trial platform. So those kind of platforms, if we focus on that now and use that, then in future, that can result in sustainability. Same thing for vaccine manufacturing. We need to do that now because those platforms can be easily switched to utilizing future emergencies and future aspects of things that we need to look into. I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you. And I'm just mindful of the time, and I do want to get to some questions that are popping up in the from the audience and are being voted up. But before I do, I just want to maybe just turn to Bogi for a second to get your thoughts on the public engagement in science at this moment, because as Charu just pointed out, this is a moment when people are paying attention. So this is a moment when we can start broadening the pie and getting people really involved. But how do we seize this moment, in your view, to create a more citizen-engaged science, if you will, that drives innovation in the future?
Yes. So yeah. Firstly, I must say that normally I'm brought in to be the wild, positive guy, but I must be a little bit cautious on some things here. So I'm the only one, or I'm not the North American one here, right? I think we can see, and this is happening all the time. We talk global, we think local, and so Tuesday, I had a long webinar with 13 of the EU research infrastructures that are together in something called Corbel, so all of the life science and biology, where the question was, how do we become relevant in COVID time? So their members, both in the countries and the organizations, they have delivered and delivered and delivered, but on the request of the national governments to the persons from the countries, not on a European level, right? So my question to them was, why should I care if you get funded next year, right? And this, I think, is a basic question for science as well. It's not just communicating what you do, it's communicating the relevance of what you do. And I don't really care if as a citizen, I don't really care if science is in 25, 50, or 2 disciplines. I just want to understand, how does this help the world, right? And this is where we need to get out of our own world and think, who are we helping? The other big challenge here is that what we at the Institute have worked with a couple of last years on what we call the new 1090 approach. What we have talked about today, and what I worked with most of my life, is cutting edge technology for the richest 10% of the world, not for the other 90%. And this is where we are beginning to fail badly. I'm working quite intensively in Latin America right now. Why is nothing working on prediction? Because all the models were made in the Western world where you don't have the favelas. You don't have this where you actually can do social distancing, right? Are we helping them? So I know you asked on how are we going out with science, but I think we also need to ask ourselves, is this a national science or is this a global science? Because what we need if we want to do the national science is actually global data. So the two things are interlinked. So the responsibility of preventing comes into this question. And this comes back to where I think science actually plays a role and where we become evidence-based. Because to me, COVID, sorry, I will sound very cynical. COVID is something on the way, on a road where we have a paradigm shift. COVID is not something which is a black swan. It's not something that will be the hugest event in history when we look back in 50 years. I'm pretty sure all the history books will say that the Western world learned to wash their hands again. That will be one of the learnings. But if we think about what we have worked with the last years on personalized health, it's moving decisions from emotions to fact. Is that still a need? Has that need become bigger with this? Yes. Is making data and insights accessible? That's what we are talking about. Building broad coalition for change. Did we hear that today? Enabling leadership for change. We also heard that today. So this is a slide I made a year ago that I'm reading off from. So we should also be modest in saying, okay, is this a new challenge or is this an intensified part of a challenge that we actually have? And this here, I think that, so there is, I think there is a place where science has failed in the COVID crisis. The vulnerable 20%, the chronically ill, the ones who cannot get their care, the ones who have a much higher mortality rate now and worse quality of life. It's fine that we jump in emergency care and do as we did, but it's definitely a failure that we left them out. And we have done so in all of the Western society. There's no exemption. So asking for science communication, it is also the responsibility that we respond with science, which we have partly done, but not fully done.
Great points. And I now want to just turn to questions from the audience. At the top of the list is a question from young, recent science graduates. So what advice would you share to science graduate students or those early in their career on how COVID is evidently impacting accessibility to gain experiences in research? How do you imagine science education and training will evolve? Who would like to tackle that? I don't know, maybe Charu, is that something you'd like to start with and others can chime in?
Yeah, so you know, again, it's very challenging. You know, if you're a recent graduate that's walking out the door, you know, in August, and you're looking for your next step, you know, what do you do at this point? I have to say that for a lot of people, dealing with the crisis itself has left, you know, and Bogi very correctly pointed out that we have failed in many places. In Canada, it's the long-term healthcare facilities and people who are affected, you know, the families and people who are living there. You know, we're not done yet. We're still in the middle of the crisis. So there's going to be a lot of looking over our shoulder to see how did we deal with that. So I am extremely worried about early career investigators, trainees that are finishing up now. You know, what's the next step for them? You know, I'm hearing a lot of people sort of say, take a gap year and kind of do something in the meantime. And I'm not sure that's the right way to go. So that's definitely something as a public funder, CIHR is very concerned about, and we are having a lot of discussions whether we need to, you know, have special recovery packages that are dealing with students, because if we dry the pipeline now and push students away from science and into, you know, doing other kinds of work, then what happens to our pipeline 5 years down the road? So I don't have a ready-made solution. I think young people are very adaptive and innovative. You know, my son is 19 and he found a computer lab that he's working on this summer, and he's online every day, you know, trying to figure out what he can do for them. So I think that kind of innovative thinking needs to come in, resourceful, and then hopefully, you know, we as the older generation who is responsible to make sure that, you know, the young people have their opportunities, you know, will come up with some solutions.
Any other thoughts from panelists before I move on?
I would just say that such individuals, they should be bold. They should come to these types of webinars and use these as experiences to learn and to identify individuals that they could reach out to gain advice, seek further advice and more in-depth advice. Go through LinkedIn, connect with people. I know I get things all the time about advice from career perspective, and you know, people are willing to provide that. So I would not be shy, be bold and inquisitive.
Yeah, I would echo that, and I think building on what I said before, we are on a paradigm shift, and paradigm shifts are metacognition, which means that we have opposing ideas which we need to merge to something that works. We see them as not working together today, but that's something we have to figure out, which also mean that, yes, you should learn some of the old stubborn things that we are raised with, but we are all raised in a reductionistic mindset. The next paradigm requires that skill with holistic mindset. So you need to be highly specialized and interdisciplinary at the same time. Our generation will not lift that. So that's going to be the next one. And I mean, if you want to link with me on LinkedIn, please, I'll accept you.
Yeah.
You're going to have a deluge of requests.
And one last thing is, you know, we're all going to get through this. And I think that there's going to be greater opportunity for people in the science fields, etc., that come out of this. And we all have to go forward with our eyes wide open. But one needs to think of things in a multidisciplinary way. I think Connie mentioned that. One needs to think about digital and being digitally adept. One needs to think about translation and translating ideas into products that help mankind in some fashion. So be bold, be open, and entrepreneurial, as we've said.
Connie?
Yeah, I wanted to also mention that capacity building in our country is really important to all of us. As you can see, this is a question that we're all very passionate about. And so collectively, I think you will see that we will build new structures. We want new researchers to continue to choose this as your field. And so we will work together to find new resolutions and to find new ways. But there was a couple comments about advocacy. And so, you know, my advice to you is that make sure your voice is heard. You know, if research is important to you, make sure that those who are in power, how important that funding is for research. You know, we've been very fortunate to have, you know, many researchers support us in our advocacy efforts. And it's by having that voice that we'll be able to make a change. So please raise your voice.
The next question from the audience, I'm going to direct to you initially, Connie, because it's related to resources, which has been a huge concern, I know, for health charities in particular, in terms of the capacity to fund research beyond COVID-19. The comment is that, you know, this may be an issue for a while. How do you see this affecting the research funding environment over the next 2 years to non-COVID health research areas?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. And this will impact us. I mean, we can't live through something like this that's going to affect our economy without having a direct impact. And so I think that's why forums like this is really important. We really have to plan appropriately. We have to determine where are we going to invest our research dollars? How can we work collaboratively together? How can we make sure that we are strategizing so that there aren't individual groups who are completely left out, which is certainly as someone who works with a coalition, we're very concerned that there will be pockets of groups that are completely left out. And that's a concern that we've had. Health charities have always been there funding research that typically would not be funded. And so we're concerned what's going to happen to that research will be completely put on ice and will be completely halted. And that's our fear, because we don't want that you know, research and innovation and those ideas to not go forward. So how can we find ways to continue moving forward while everything is kind of sitting and we have to reprioritize for a while? But that's going to involve many players coming together and saying, okay, well, who can take on what pieces? How can we strategize collectively? How can we work within our system to the best of our abilities? And how can we work differently? We heard today about, you know, different ways we can work, looking at things. We didn't get a chance to talk about peer review and, you know, how we can collectively pool our resources, but there's lots of things that are happening. And I think that, you know, as we work together, it'll be different, but we are all committed to research, and we will continue to move forward to make sure that that funding can be best spent in, you know, the best way that we can.
Any other panelists want to speak to the resourcing issue?
Yeah, I'll just say that I think we'll come out on the other end of it with more funding and more public understanding of research. So I think this is a good time to be in research and science. Like I said, never before has public or governments been aware of the contribution of research and science. You know, public servants and like me are constantly advocating for science, but now the government is coming to CIHR and saying, well, how much money do you need for us to push the vaccines through or find new therapeutics? So never before have governments been reliant or looking for solutions. So it's a great time to be in science. You know, in the next 3 months, not, but the future is optimistic, because hopefully from this will come the recognition that things have to be done and things, you know, so resourcing, I think resources, probably we'll have to modify, like Connie says, how exactly we'll do it. But I think that we will actually emerge out of this with more resources for science and research.
Yeah, especially when we think about something you alluded to, Ryan, was the One Health imperative about animal health and human health, and how they come together. And we know the situation here with COVID. You know, we collectively let our guard down. And we definitely need greater global investments in surveillance and research and data sharing. Yeah, and I know that, and I think we need to globalize how we work together. And I think a number of people have said that's important. We need, in order to do research and come up with solutions, we need global data, right? Bogi, I think you mentioned that, and
Yeah.
It's an important piece. So there's opportunity there, and people need to look at that. And I'm sure that, you know, one way to get away from these types of national protectionism, such as what we've seen in the press over the last little bit around vaccines, etc., is and that whole vaccine nationalism, which is spurred by significant investments by governments and non-government agencies towards academic groups or companies. One way to really counter that and think of things in a global way is to have those global investments on an ongoing basis, even when there's in a non-pandemic environment, to really spur the innovation, etc., and better prepare us all to deal with these types of situations.
Yeah, yes, if I can. So I think it's resources need to be thought locally, regionally, national-wise, and global-wise. And I also think that if there are some things that we need to take in on that part. So what we have seen, I think there are many positive things, even if I was a bit critical before, because I hope that we will push resources in merging clinical and research, which is an issue that is divided, that we finally understand that you can have hypothesis-driven research and not need hypotheses for everything, which has been a challenging part of these things. But I will flag, if we want data, and we want data from the individual, we would need to give the individual more than risk by giving you, right? So what we need here is accountability, traceability, and transparency on data. The regime on that the data will not harm you if you share is not there. And if we want to protect ourselves against a second pandemic like this, there are two main ways. One is that we make the old city-state like we did now. So like in the old Viking age, you would go under the king's domain if he promised you food security and protection against the enemy. This is more or less what we have done. We went not 10 years back, we went 1,000 years back in mindset on that one. But there are two ways here. One thing is that we protect the country. The other thing is that we have a tsunami early warning way where we actually contain it when it comes out. And maybe we need to do both in some way. But that requires a data regime which has a transparency and traceability which we have not seen yet. And we need to work on that. And we have worked a bit on this idea, and I can't see any other way than that we all embrace WHO and work that way to try to realize it.
Agreed. I'm conscious of the time. We have, I think, 1 minute left, but I did want to ask one more audience question, if I might, and hopefully get a very quick answer, but it's come from someone, actually a colleague in the Middle East, about IP and regulatory strategies to promote open and sharing of information and to drive research and innovation. Do those IP regulatory strategies need to change? Maybe Jim, I'll put that question to you.
Do they need to change? I would say in some way, well, definitely regulatory harmonization and reform across, as I had mentioned, to make it a more consistent process and engagement across the globe. So that as you think about extending access to products that could help certain populations, you know, we're not encumbered with these dead ends because of pharmacopoeia, etc. That said, I think we need to be better in making sure that when we're starting out and developing products, we're paying attention to the pharmacopoeia across, but it's a two-way street there. From an intellectual property perspective, obviously, People are going to want to protect their inventions, their products. And I think, again, a better understanding of the intellectual property environment in different regions, different countries is important. But one also needs to take in hand, when you're developing products, etc., the differences in the IP process environment in those regions to develop the appropriate strategy. That's not to say there can't be some type of reform, etc., but that's going to be a tough road to hoe in dealing with the different countries and regions. And so I think you just need to think about those things as part of your regulatory and IP strategies as you're doing your product development. So sorry, it probably wasn't the most crisp answer, but you know, we struggle with that every day.
No, that's fine. That's good. Thank you. And I'm going to have to close it there. I want to thank all of you for your time today. I wish we had another hour to chat. One final question for all of you, just to close things up before I turn it back to Jason, is in 5 words or less, or preferably in 1 word, how would you describe the health research and innovation system of the future? Bogi, I'll start with you.
5 words. Transparency, traceability, accountability, and free data.
Charu?
I would say stronger, resilient, innovative, and adaptable.
Connie?
Engaging emergent collaboration.
And Jim?
Can I add the first slide? No, joking. So I would say from data deluge to data decisions.
Great. Thank you. And thank you all again. We will be sharing a summary of this discussion, and I believe it will also be available through LSO's website to view the video recording in the future. So thank you all, and thank you to our audience for staying with us. Jason?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, and thank you to our panelists and you, Ryan, for hosting today. Our next webinar is tentatively scheduled for June 11th. It was mentioned just briefly that the agri-food sector has had a particularly interesting role in COVID-19 in terms of how they've been impacted as well as their response. And we have an expert from the University of Guelph, Professor Mike von Massow, who's going to be joining us for that session. So hopefully you can join us for that. I'd also like to just really quickly thank our sponsors. So our platinum sponsors, Alexion, Sanofi, Shift Health. Thank you, Ryan, for your support, as always. Silicon Valley Bank, Innovative Medicines Canada, and Merck. Our gold sponsors, Horizon, Taiho, Admere, and Stryker. And finally, our silver sponsors, EY, Roche, BDO, CRB, and University of Toronto, Scarborough. Appreciate all of their support. We wouldn't be able to do these events without their support. For those of you that have just joined LSO for the first time in one of our events, please check out our website. We do a lot of these sorts of educational networking events when we finally get to meet again in person. And hopefully you'll continue to join us for those. So once again, thank you for taking the time to attend. Stay safe, stay healthy. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.